Hello everybody, welcome to the second day of Soil3's YouTube Live presentations about fall vegetable gardening. Just like yesterday, the presentations will last 2 hours and we've got Brie Arthur and Chris Smith again telling us about fall vegetable gardening. There's a lot more to learn. They're again going to tell you about what you plant now, or this fall, for harvesting later in the fall, in the winter, and the spring. Also, to cover interacting with YouTube a little bit better than I did yesterday, I wasn't aware that the subscribe button on YouTube Live is not actually a button. It's the word subscribe in bold red, just a little bit below the video. So please subscribe to our channel so you can be notified of more presentations and videos in the future. Also, I was mentioning the notes section. The notes section is there. It's below the video. It's next to the name, Fall Vegetable Gardening Day 2. It's a little arrow with very thin lines. If you press that little arrow, the notes will pop down and you'll see the speakers' biographies and links to their books and links to Soil³ and the schedule for today. Also, it turns out the comments section is not available in YouTube Live. However, this presentation is being recorded, so once it's over, it will take a few hours for it to upload to YouTube, and then it will be available for you to watch again, and the comments section will be available. And we will be answering those comments, especially during the next week, but we'll get a notification anytime a comment is made, and we will make sure you will be answered. So thank you for joining us again today, and here's Brie.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for tuning in. Yesterday was such a joy. This is like a whole new platform, and we had no idea who would tune in and how many people there would be, and I was so excited to get messages from people following my talk, so thank you, and I hope that you'll keep in touch, and I hope that my presentation today will inspire you to get outside and start looking at your landscape with some fresh eyes, because there's really nothing but possibilities as far as your ornamental beds that you have surrounding your house, and the opportunities that inserting some fall vegetables that you love to eat into those common landscapes will offer you. So if you're just tuning in, my name is Brie Arthur, and I have been working in the horticulture industry for 20 years, but pretty much my books and my platform on Foodscaping were all derived just from my passion as a home gardener, living in the suburbs where I wasn't necessarily allowed to have a segregated traditional vegetable garden. I had to figure out ways to get around my homeowner association rules, and in doing so, I started to really develop a landscape that was both beautiful and bountiful. And that led me to write my first book and got me to really start looking at landscapes more critically, start thinking about all of the opportunities that this developed space offers. So let's get into the basics of what a foodscape is, because this is not a very complicated idea at all. I often find that people try to make it more difficult than it needs to be, so stop that right now. I want you to think as simply as possible. I want you to walk outside and just evaluate the areas that you have that are sunny, but where you may have open mulch space. And then I want you to start envisioning how you could better utilize that area. So my definition is really quite simple. A foodscape is just a landscape that produces food and flowers. It's basically a living ecosystem that supports beneficial insects and your family all at the same time, all mixed together. Here we have an Asclepias and a pepper plant literally growing next to each other. It's as simple as that. Now, whenever somebody asks me about foodscaping, or I'm dealing with a difficult homeowner association with very strict architectural review boards, this is the photograph that I first show. And I always ask, can you tell me what about this is offensive? Can you identify where the vegetables are versus where the ornamentals are? Are you fundamentally opposed to sharing produce with your neighbors when you grow more than you need? You know, what part of vegetables makes it so not reasonable to grow in a suburban landscape? Generally, nobody can come up with why they don't like this idea, right? Well, this is the landscape of my mentor and friend and kind of just life goals human being, Rosalind Creasy. And if you're not familiar with the work of Roz Creasy, go ahead and start Google stalking her right now. She's written 23 books on this subject. Order them all. It will change your life. I was lucky as a 13-year-old 4-H'er growing up in southeastern Michigan that I read Roz's first book, The Edible Landscape, and it totally changed my world. I convinced my parents that we needed to take out those high maintenance shrubs that we were having to cut with hedge clippers and start using that landscape as an area to be able to grow some of the food that we ate. And from that moment on, it's just always been kind of an ethic of mine that if I am devoting time and energy to maintaining a space, I really should be getting something else out of it. Not only an ecological benefit, but the opportunity to grow food to feed myself and my family and to share with other people in my community, because this is an incredible opportunity to make more food available to people who really need it. So, I define foodscaping technically as the integration of edibles in an ornamental landscape and containers. Yesterday I talked about containers, today we're going to talk about in-ground planting. And ultimately I just see every landscape as a place where we could be cultivating so much more than just high maintenance hedges and, disease-ridden roses and, boring plants. I'm tired of seeing green meatballs everywhere, and I'm ready to start seeing the landscape industry play a role that's really critical for our society. We have the ability to grow things like hydrangeas and knockout roses. We also have the ability to cultivate food crops that will ultimately enhance the communities that we live in. So what are some of the foodscape design basics? Well, what I really want to encourage you is to always start with a plan. Now, whether you draw the plan or you hire a professional to help you, that's up to you, but having a plan drawn to scale will act as a base map. And it's really important so that you can understand how much square footage you have available, how much soil you'll need, how much mulch, how many plants can you actually fit into that area. So having that base map is always step one. And then make sure that you select ornamental plants that you love that will ultimately provide you structure. Because here's the thing, if you're like me and you live in a suburban neighborhood, it's important that you recognize that you're not actually a farmer, you're a home gardener. And you moved into that neighborhood, your neighbors have the expectation that your yard isn't going to be an incredible disruption, right? Well, there's no reason that you can't grow food and not be a disruptor. So that's where your ornamental plants really come into play. So I'm not saying that you can't have hydrangeas and knockout roses. I'm telling you, you can grow those alongside all of your favorite vegetables. Now, obviously, most of the food crops do prefer growing in more sun than shade. And I'm going to be focusing primarily on fall and cool season vegetables that like more sun today. One of the great advantages of a foodscape is that it offers you more square footage to be able to rotate your crops. And this is one of the big challenges that people face when they are vegetable gardening. Because typically, if you're growing, say, in raised beds or one segregated part of your yard where you cultivate vegetables, you don't really have the ability to properly rotate your crops. And what you end up with are insect and disease pressure. Whereas in a foodscape, you have your entire landscape to be able to utilize. That's thousands of square feet more than what you would have in a traditional vegetable garden. Now, I really strongly believe in cover crops, and I know that this is something that Chris is really an expert on, and I keep picking his brain. Cover crops are something that aren't just for farmers, and frankly, home gardeners need to learn more about ways that we can utilize cover crops, not only to improve our soil, but also to be able to make our landscapes more dynamic and interesting. And that for me was a big motivation for writing Gardening with Grains, because many of the grain crops, when paired with a legume, will act as a cover crop. And it doesn't matter if you're not doing 10 acres, you can do 10 square feet in a cover crop, and it will ultimately improve your soil. Now for me, focusing on diversity is the most important thing that we can do as home gardeners. So I've already addressed this yesterday, but most of our vegetable crops aren't very diverse, and that's where the advantage of a foodscape comes in, because the diversity is represented in your ornamental palette. And then devoting a proper budget to quality soil, specifically Soil³. I can't stress this enough, and it goes right back to number one. When you have a plan and you understand how much space you have, you're going to be able to better understand how to develop your budget. Both of these things are really important for long-term success and satisfaction. Now, don't grow vegetables that you don't like to eat. This should be obvious, but it's often not. You know, you go to the garden center and they have the same 4 or 5 things, and you just buy those because that's what you're supposed to grow. And it turns out, oh, you actually don't like eggplant, but you have all this eggplant in your garden, right? Stop that. Write down what you eat for a week. Find the 5 vegetables that keep recurring and focus on growing those things. Grow them in a meaningful way so that you can actually change a habit at the grocery store. You know, like for me, we eat garlic every day, and after hearing Chris's talk yesterday, I'm even more jazzed up about garlic. In fact, during his presentation, I started ordering garlic because I have zero self-control. I'm so excited about all the garlic varieties that he mentioned. Now I know so much more about what I want to grow in my garden and ways and strategies to incorporate those. But garlic is practical. It's something that we eat every day, and we need a lot of it. I don't want to buy garlic that is being brought in from halfway across the world. I want to be a conscious consumer and make good decisions about how I use the land in my own garden. Now, what I really like to do is make sure that you grow enough so that you can not only provide food for yourself, but also share with your friends and family so that you can start to encourage them to pick up this awesome hobby of gardening. And I guarantee you, when you drop off a big, beautiful, fresh head of broccoli, not only are they going to be excited to eat it, but they're going to start asking you questions about how you grew it. And that is ultimately how we spread the good word of gardening, one person at a time, giving practical, encouraging advice to one another. So I mentioned starting with a plan. I cannot stress this enough. Drawing it out will really help make you make more decisive decisions. So here I have a desert island. This in the suburbs is known as the space where all of your utilities are located. And your developer was required to put a handful of evergreen shrubs in to hide, all those different boxes. Well, why not go in and start adding a few food crops that would actually make you utilize that island bed out in the middle of your front lawn? So the idea of like a strawberry ground cover, that way you don't have to constantly add mulch. Putting in berry hedges, things like blueberries, which are native to the southeast. Low maintenance, they love full sun, and it will give you a reason to go out to that bed in addition to feeding all of the native birds. Of course, adding ornamental trees, shrubs, grasses, and different flowering perennials is a great way to create habitat for different insects. And then filling in the open spaces with seasonal edibles. Anything through the summer and through the cool season offers you an opportunity to take the most advantage of this available square footage without you having to create a new bed. You don't have to tear out any grass. You just take advantage of a space that the builder already created for you. Now, the main thing with foodscaping is that I want you to have a well-balanced plant palette that takes advantage of plants from all of these categories. Don't get stuck just thinking you can only grow native plants, because the reality is we eat plants that are from all over the planet that get shipped from all over the planet. So the more vegetables that you grow and eat, the better it is for our environment in the long haul. Now, remember that food crops lack diversity, like really lack diversity. It's really easy as a vegetable gardener to create a monoculture totally unintentionally. So right now for the cool season, everybody's getting excited about broccoli and cauliflower and cabbage and collards and kale. But technically all of those plants come from the Brassicaceae family. That means they are all essentially the same plant. Over hundreds of years, people have made different selections to differentiate these plants, but at the end of the day, these plants will all have the same trouble with insects and diseases. So when you plant these in the same space year after year, you are creating a monoculture. Now, I mentioned yesterday the use of BT, because the number one thing that brassica crops have is this tiny little cabbage worm. It's that green thing. They're really hard to see because they look just like the leaves. And I recommended putting out powdered BT. And then I was asked what gram-positive means, and I don't know what that means. So I looked it up, and honest to God, the definition did not help with my understanding of what gram-positive means, other than saying the bacterium has a thicker cell wall, which I am led to assume means that it has a longer lifespan when you put it out into your garden on your plants. If someone knows better, please get in touch with me and let me know so I have a better understanding. Basically, what BT does, in my very simple definition, the worms eat it, they feel full, and then they starve to death. Simple as that. So I mentioned that your ornamental palette is where your biological diversity comes from. And typically in a live setting, I'll ask the audience, like, how many of you have a crepe myrtle or a hydrangea or a conifer or a camellia? And you know I'm a camellia enthusiast. The thing is, all those plants come from different plant families, and diversity in your plant palette is based on what family those plants come from. So when you're planting a landscape, go beyond just the genus and species and actually look at what family your selections are coming from, and then start counting how many. The average suburban landscape automatically has 8 different plant families just because of the ornamental plant palette. So I wanted to give you a quick tour of my home foodscape. These are photographs that I took just about 3 days ago, and this is the entry into our front door. And you know, most people have no idea that I'm even growing vegetables in this area. However, I have basil and zucchini and tomatoes and peppers and eggplants and various herbs planted in and amongst zinnias and cleome and salvias. And not only is this an area that's super productive, but it's absolutely filled with beautiful pollinators, including monarchs, swallowtails, and hummingbirds. So it's a great place to be able to sit, drink a cup of coffee, and enjoy my suburban landscape. Now, moving into my backyard, it is a brilliant wilderness of lots of different colors, textures, and a lot of different plant diversity. So there's, you know, ornamental plants, there's annuals, and there's food crops all mixed together seamlessly. Generally, nobody can really define one space from another. Another area walking along to my north side of the house where I have entryways covered in pumpkins, and we'll see how those do. As if they actually form giant pumpkins. I'm not sure how that will fare if they're 10 foot up in the air. But nevertheless, it's a welcoming environment where I'm able to have beautiful flower displays right along the areas that I'm harvesting. So, is a foodscape deer-proof? First of all, stop asking that question, because of course it's not. And yes, I have deer that visit my yard every single day, and actually this one has grown so large that it looks like a horse, and it's not scared of us at all, and our cats actually kind of go up and sniff it, and you know, it's exactly what you imagine a suburban deer to be. And it's actually getting a little particular in that, you know, it really likes my rarest plants. I don't know how they know to distinguish a rare plant from a common plant, but they have that ability. So the thing is, it's not just deer that are eating in our landscapes, and this is one of the great things that's universal and brings gardeners all together. Like, I like to focus on all the things that we have in common versus the things that divide us, and generally a dissatisfaction to walking out into your garden and seeing a plant eaten by any one of these creatures is something that all gardeners have in common. So, you know, we've got moles and deer and squirrels and voles and rabbits. The armadillos are on their way, which I am not looking forward to. So, you know, it's a complex set of issues to be able to deal with, and it's important that you are aware. And some of my solutions are really pretty simple. You know, if you live in a space where you can put up large fencing, by all means do that. Most of us living in the suburbs aren't allowed to put a 10-foot fence around our entire property, so that's not always the solution. So for me, I use repellents like the I Must Garden, which I mentioned yesterday. What I love about that is there's a different formulation for every different creature, because remember, deer repellent doesn't actually work on squirrels. So you have to have different varieties of repellent to deal with each of the different critters. Now, reflective tape is a great option, especially in the fall when the deer are in rut and they're rubbing their antlers, especially on your expensive Japanese maples. The Vole King bags are one of the greatest things that have ever been created to help deter, well, to help eliminate the voles from eating the roots of the plants that you have in the ground. And really the ultimate solution are these motion-censored irrigation systems, which I absolutely love. The important thing with those is that you move them around, because it's the element of surprise that really works, especially against deer. So I actually don't recommend putting them into your irrigation system, but rather hook them up to a hose and move that hose around every couple of days. Now remember, this will shoot water at anything that moves. So if you happen to be having a small dinner party, you need to remember to turn it off for the night, or all of your dinner party gifts are going to get slammed with water as they leave your house. I say this from experience. Now I have a couple of foodscaping solutions to help with the animals that browse through your landscape, and I'm actually going to dive into these in my plant pairing section. But this includes things like spicy greens, basil through the summertime, garlic and onions, which Chris is going to talk more about in the next session, and planting potatoes. And I find that this is a list of very practical food crops that most people eat on a regular basis. So not only does this help with deterring animals, but it's also a very useful list to be able to grow and use for your regular eating. So, you know, again, practicality is everything for me. I'm not going to put the effort towards growing something that I don't actually utilize. So some of my suggestions for how to grow the plants on this list are here. You know, arugula is a cool season crop, and you can basically direct seed it along your bed edges anytime August to April. Basil's a warm season crop, so you'd be planting that in the spring after the threat of frost. Garlic, as Chris mentioned yesterday, really October is an ideal time. I give people a broad window, September to December, depending on where you live. And if you can't find time to plant garlic in a 3-month period, you really do need to reevaluate your priorities. Herbs you can transplant year-round, especially here in the southeast. Mustard, just like arugula, you have a really broad window to be able to direct seed. Onions, again, in the fall, just like garlic, and I'm so excited to learn more about onions coming up next. And potatoes, I have found that you can actually plant potatoes in the southeast year-round. Basically, anytime I have potatoes that start sprouting, I stick them out into a landscape border right along the edge. So I want you to select the very best plants for your region, and since this is virtual, you may be living in an area that isn't, zone 6 through zone 9 in the southeast US. So one of the best resources is All American Selections, and this is a plant trialing program put on by the nonprofit National Gardening Bureau. And so you can get a lot of really great information, not only on national winners, but on regional winners. So check out aas.com for more information. Now, just like yesterday in the containers, the foodscaping idea is all about matching the cultural needs of the plants that you're growing. And cultural needs really indicates how much sunlight a plant needs and then how much water it's going to require. So if you're living in a lot of shade, you're going to do better with leafy greens, and that's fine because we're in leafy green season and you can eat salads every day without the worry of E. coli or listeria, so that's a huge bonus. For most of us growing vegetables in more sun than shade, you're going to have a lot more opportunities to be able to grow more diversity in the crops. I always focus on organic fertility in the landscape and in my containers. And it starts with quality compost, and then I primarily use just a really simple organic powdered fertilizer like plant tone or holly tone or garden tone. And then I like to do fish emulsion. Basically every 30 days I try to put out a fish emulsion drench once a month, especially in my container plants, but also on my vegetable crops so that they get all the nutrients that they really need. Now, top dressing with Soil³. This is the most important thing that you can do for successful vegetable gardening. Especially living in the suburbs and in a new development, your soil is wrecked, okay? There's just no other way of putting it. There's been all this heavy equipment compacting the soil down. They've stripped all the topsoil so that your foundation isn't gonna move around, so that's actually important. But then none of that topsoil is brought back in when they put down your green matter. So it's your job when you move into that house to start improving your soil. And the easiest way to do that is by top dressing with Soil³. You can top dress your landscape, you can top dress your lawn. All the spaces that you have plants growing are going to benefit from the addition of Soil³. So why do I like Soil³ so much? Well, I'll tell you, I have spent thousands of dollars on poison soil. So it's because of experience that I have come to discover this soil and fall deeply in love with it. And I don't care if I sound irrational to people, because soil is the most important thing if you are gardening. And that is it. Like, I am addicted to plant shopping, but if I didn't invest in soil, all that plant shopping would be for no reason at all. So the most important thing to learn here is that there's no persistent herbicides, and I cannot stress this enough. Most of the compost that I am seeing that's being sold by distributors, they don't track where that compost came from. And especially if you're getting horse manure, those horses are almost guaranteed that they ate hay that had been treated with an herbicide, because the farmers very logically are trying to get their fields to dry evenly. So it's not this sinister plot, it's just, a way of making it so that harvesting is more practical, but the long run, it will actually hurt the plants that you're growing in it. And this year especially, I have seen so many people asking me questions and posting photos of, like, why do all their plants look crinkled and wrinkly and why aren't they setting fruit? And when we really get down into the basics, it's because they bought killer compost, is what we call it. That persistent herbicide can last up to 7 years, and there's no treatment for getting rid of it other than, like, scraping it away. So just start with soil that doesn't have poison in it. That's the easiest solution. Now, I like child labor. You're going to see some of it in this presentation. I think that children benefit so much from being outside, understanding where food comes from, learning to eat a more healthy diet, having respect for what farmers provide for us. And I get really excited when the junior master gardeners visit me and they very enthusiastically can empty an entire cubic yard of Soil³ in under 20 minutes. One thing I've learned about gardening with children is if you time them, they actually work even more efficiently. So that's a really good tip. But in the case of this crew that came from Cumberland County, North Carolina, they did this and they sowed this beautiful array of seed, and literally 2 months later, that is what grew from their efforts. And I think that it's really important that kids get to experience not only the labor side of gardening, but the true benefit of the time and effort that they've spent. And so I was so fortunate to be able to not only have them come and do the hard work, but be able to come back and enjoy the splendor. And now they're all addicted to sunflowers, just like me. Of course, the sunflower border isn't just for people. This is a really important bird seed source. So if you're into birding, be sure to grow some of your own sunflowers and different grains so that you can actually grow your own bird seed. Now, what are the best plants for a fall foodscape in the Southeast? So I'm very specifically talking about plants for zones 6 through 9. Well, some of these I mentioned yesterday. I talked a bit about mums, and mums in containers, tend to be those little round basketball things that you buy every fall and then you throw away. Even though most of those are hardy, and if you planted them out in your landscape and didn't treat them with a growth regulator, they would actually grow into a really beautiful specimen that looks a bit more normal. I love garden mums. I actually use garden mums as a living mulch because I don't want to have to add mulch to all of my landscape borders, and I'd rather have something that provides this beautiful color and diversity and nectar source for fall pollinators. Now, I have a thing for snapdragons. I don't know whether it's just like my 3-year-old self coming out, but I can't live without snapdragons. It's sort of irrational. They actually self-sow in all the cracks of my different patios and stuff, and I'm like, no, you can't pull that. That's a snapdragon. So we have snapdragons coming up everywhere. But I just think that they are one of the most delightful little plants to have sort of scrambling around, and I love all the colors. I like the flat facing ones too that actually don't have the squeezability, but I don't think I've ever met a snapdragon I didn't like. So, and I feel the same way about violas. I do prefer violas over pansies. I like the smaller flower. I like their cold hardiness. I like their versatility in that you can grow them in the ground, you can grow them in containers, and I like that you could eat them. I just think that's a really fun thing. Like I mentioned yesterday, Abby loves to throw violas into her salads, and just think it's a really cheerful addition. Now, some other cool season flowers that aren't going to bloom in the fall, but I want you to know about because they are so awesome. And truly, you haven't lived a happy life until your landscape looks like the Wizard of Oz, right? So these are things that you need to sow in the fall so that you have a spring show, okay? So this includes buckwheat and crimson clover. I am totally addicted to buckwheat and crimson clover. I actually grow buckwheat year round because I just figure, why not? The seed is really inexpensive, and if it doesn't grow in one season, then I can learn from that. Last year, it was actually winter active for me because we didn't get very cold. I would suspect that if this year's prediction of it being much colder than normal, maybe buckwheat wouldn't be hardy. But crimson clover is such a beautiful nitrogen-fixing cover crop that belongs in every suburban landscape. This is not just for farmers. This is something that everybody can sow just a handful of seeds in an area and be able to enjoy the beauty of this plant. Larkspur. Larkspur may be the most beautiful flower of all time, and the fact that it's poisonous to animals is a huge benefit. So if you grow enough larkspur, you're not going to have deer in your landscape through the springtime. I know this from experience. I have watched the deer come up to a larkspur border, sniff it, and run across the street and then go and eat from my neighbor's yard. And frankly, when you're talking about animals, that is sort of what you're doing. You're just trying to redirect them to eat from someone else's yard. Now, poppies. Poppies were really one of the first flowers that I was introduced to when I moved to North Carolina and worked as an estate gardener. We were trying to manage 100 acres, and we had to do it inexpensively and efficiently. So direct seeding poppies throughout open borders in the sunny landscape was a really effective way to make a dynamic spring show that didn't really cost anything. So the poppies come in all different colors, and once you start growing them and collecting your own seed, you'll find that you have a whole rainbow of different colors and different petal structures. And Nigella, Love in the Mist, which actually does have an edible seed, which is very delicious. But this is such a beautiful little light texture. I like putting these, closer to the front of the border, whereas larkspur and poppies get much taller, so those are better mid to back of the border. Nigella is just such a beautiful plant, and it's a wonderful plant to add for cut arrangements. Now, there's a bunch of cool season grains that you should also grow because everybody should become a crazy grain person. Some of my favorites include barley, oats, rye, and wheat. And this picture here, just to really get you excited, is the barley border planted in the Serpentine Garden at Chanticleer, which is just outside of Philadelphia. And they've been doing these grain installations with the juxtaposition of, perfectly mown grass so that people can have an appreciation for the beauty of agricultural crops. I was so inspired by that I actually created a swath in the middle of my front lawn, and that is what had really inspired me to write Gardening with Grains, because I realized that in my suburban development, people had never seen wheat, and all of a sudden it was where everyone in the neighborhood wanted to take their Mother's Day pictures. And it really brought me this aha moment of how we as home gardeners can be very creative in the plant palette that we take advantage of. So some cool season greens that you can direct seed anytime, really starting now all the way until March, include arugula, chard, cilantro, collards, kale, lettuce, mustard. I forgot to add spinach, but really the sky is the limit for leafy greens through the cool season. And then, of course, cool season heading vegetables. So these are the vegetables that, are going to grow more into full size. So these are not appropriate necessarily for direct seeding. Instead, you can buy starts or you can start seed in trays, and then you're going to be transplanting those out into your garden with appropriate spacing. Because here's the deal. Cabbage does take up a lot more room than, say, a kale plant that you can plant, any leafy green really, that you're going through and just harvesting the foliage off of. So understanding spacing for heading vegetables is far more important. And then root crops. And I think sometimes people don't always understand how important root crops are for soil improvement. So if you live in a development where you have hard pan clay and you're like, oh my gosh, I just can't deal with the soil, I have to buy $1,000 worth of lumber and create a raised bed. Actually, you can invest $10 in root crop seeds and do these actually as a cover crop, and they'll essentially aerate that hard pan soil. With the addition of Soil³ in one season, you'll be able to start utilizing your native ground. So this is a really easy approach to soil improvement that ultimately offers you a meaningful harvest. I'm obsessed with root crops. My family, is from Eastern Europe, and so eating things like rutabagas and parsnips were just part of what we did when I was growing up. And the fact that they give me the benefit of soil improvement is just, one added check mark. So let's get into some of my favorite Foodscape combinations. And so I've done these with an ornamental plant that's going to provide you some fall interest, with an edible pairing, and I've done them based on ornamental by alphabetizing them. Not the world's most creative approach. But agastache. I can't get enough agastache. It's a fantastic native perennial. It's a really important nectar source for a lot of different pollinators, both native and non-native. And if you want to see monarchs lose their mind, plant a bunch of agastache, because this is guaranteed to be a really important pollinator source or nectar source for the monarchs. One thing that's a big advantage of agastaches, or really any plant in the Lamiaceae family or the mint family, is that the deer and rabbits and groundhogs tend to not like the flavor of these plants because they're minty. So, you know, if you live in an area where you have a lot of animal pressure, adding more plants that have that mint flavor is going to really be a great benefit for you. So I like to grow my agastache with colorful things like Swiss chard. I really love Swiss chard, not because I love eating it, because I actually don't really like the flavor of Swiss chard compared to other leafy greens, but I'm completely addicted to these beautiful rainbow stems. And I mentioned this yesterday, I like growing Swiss chard in containers, especially containers that are up in the air so that you can see the sunlight come through. But they're a really nice accent for flowering perennials that are winter dormant, because then the Swiss chard will provide the all-season interest. Now, Asclepias tuberosa and all of the milkweeds in general are really the most important plants that you can be adding to your landscapes. This is the exclusive source for food for monarch caterpillars. So if you want to, you know, have a garden that is really helping the native ecology, get more milkweeds, but I really recommend Asclepias tuberosa because it's a great perennial that grows in normal garden conditions. It doesn't need excessive wet, it doesn't need excessive dry. It comes back year after year and it blooms from May all the way until frost. So not only does it provide food for the caterpillars, but it's a great nectar source for monarchs and swallowtails and skippers and bees and all kinds of different beautiful insects. Now the funny thing is monarchs are not specific to any sort of plant for their nectar source. So you'll see monarchs visiting things like asters and tagetes and zinnias and what do I have there? Gomphrena. Like basically anything that provides nectar, monarchs will take advantage of. But their caterpillars require milkweed in order to develop. So you should have all of these plants because who doesn't get excited about seeing butterflies outside in their landscape? Now I like to pair my Asclepias with peanuts. Now I know peanuts aren't a vegetable that you're planting right now. This is a plant that you would be direct seeding once you're frost free when your soil is warm, but you're harvesting it in the fall. And I just can't not talk about peanuts because I think this is again a plant that, you know, checks off all these boxes. It's really pretty, it's low maintenance, it's heat tolerant, it's drought tolerant, it's a legume so it fixes nitrogen. It's just really well suited for southeastern gardening conditions. I started growing peanuts because there are farmers around me that were growing it and they don't harvest all of the nuts. And I went out and gleaned from the field, which is a nice way of saying like I stole some peanuts from property that wasn't mine. But I've grown peanuts now for 10 seasons and it never ceases to amaze me how much fun they are to grow, how entertained people are by ripping them out of the ground. I like to plant mine in May and I like to harvest usually around Halloween, you know, late October into November, depending on rainfall. So it's really important when you harvest your peanuts that you pull them out of the ground and you just lay them in the sun to really dry out for a few days. So you want to time your harvest based on the weather patterns that you're experiencing. Now, azaleas. You can't live in the South and not have an azalea somewhere. And we're really fortunate to have so many beautiful native azaleas. They tend to be deciduous, but have really amazingly large and fragrant blooms. But I consider all azaleas worthy in your garden. I love encore azaleas because you get so much flowering from them. And azaleas are really well suited to be planted with cool season crops. And so here we actually have encore azaleas flanking that giant broccoli plant. So I love to put brassicas at the base of azaleas because most people have azaleas in their foundation landscape, and it's a really neat way to get people introduced to the idea of foodscaping because here you have this really common shrub with, I think, a very practical vegetable, and they can make that connection, really seeing like, okay, I get it. I can grow azaleas and I can grow broccoli and I can grow them together. Now, you can't not grow blueberries, period. Even if you don't like eating them yourself, it's fine. The birds will eat them for you. You don't even have to try. If you're trying to grow blueberries for yourself, you might become in a war with birds at some point. My recommendation for that is just grow more blueberries, okay? Don't put up netting. Don't go to great lengths to deter birds. Just plant more blueberry plants, okay? That's the easiest solution. Now, two of my favorite varieties are Powder Blue and Legacy. And these have both performed really well for me in Zone 7 because they have the right amount of chill hours. So chill hours are the most important thing for fruit trees, and this is going to differ greatly depending on where you live. But you know, for central North Carolina, if we grow blueberries that only need 300 hours of chill hours, they're gonna bloom too early and then they're gonna get frosted, so then they don't set very much fruit. So it's really easy to just type into Google chill hours with your zip code, and actually USDA has done all the work for you, so you can figure out what your average chill hours are for where you live, and then you can make better decisions about the varieties of fruiting crops that you grow. Now, blueberries, of course, have really great fall color, and that, in addition to the exfoliating bark and the beautiful flowers in spring and the berry set through summer, make blueberries the ideal candidate for, you know, foodscaping because they're pretty all the time. So basically, every landscaper can wrap their head around planting blueberries. Remember, they need acid soil. My trick for growing blueberries is to dig a trench, fill it entirely with pine fines. You can find that at box stores and garden centers, sold as soil conditioner. It's really important that you acidify your soil so that your blueberries will grow to their peak. And then you want to make sure that you use like a holly-tone or an acid fertilizer because they really need acidic conditions. Now, I grow strawberries at the base of my ground cover, or I'm sorry, at the base of my blueberries because I want all of that square footage to be harvestable. And it is the coolest thing to go out and harvest strawberries for 2 months and then go out and harvest blueberries from that same space. Chandler is the variety that I've had the greatest success with, as it's a perennial for the southeast climate and it's day neutral. It's still going to set the primary amount of fruit through the spring, but occasionally, especially if you have a mild summer, you'll actually get strawberries to form through the fall and even in summer. Now, Brugmansia is a plant that it just has the most incredible fragrance. It's actually day length triggered, so these only bloom with shorter days. In warmer climates, these are, you know, they actually bloom through the entire winter. For me, where we tend to get frost sometime in mid-November, they die to the ground and come back as a perennial. And I just think that they are such an extraordinary flower, these giant trumpets. To me, that's actually the smell of Halloween because they're usually blooming on Halloween. And I like to just direct seed radishes at the base of these. I don't grow food with the Brugmansias through the summer because the Brugmansias are heavy feeders and I don't need my food crops to be competing for resources, but I grow low input vegetables like radishes at the base through the cool season. And I really love these two varieties, Roxanne and Wasabi. I'll warn you, wasabi's hot. Not only does it look like wasabi because it's green, but it is a really brightly flavored radish, so be prepared. Now, I love camellias. I specialized in camellias for almost a decade. I can't not talk about them. Camellia sasanqua are the fall blooming species that you start to see blooming right now. They're a fantastic evergreen. Unlike Camellia japonica, they'll tolerate a lot more sun. I've actually seen some of the best looking Camellia sasanqua hedges in full sun parking lots. Like, that's like the worst place, right, to live as a plant, and yet camellias will tolerate that. So some varieties that I recommend, Autumn Sunrise. This tends to be one of the earliest blooming varieties, typically starting to bloom the 3rd week of August. You'll get these flowers well into November. And then snow flurry, which is frankly my favorite blizzard as a Southeasterner. I don't actually like snow, but I like plants that look like snow, and snow flurry provides that for me. Now, Camellia sinensis is another fall blooming variety, but this is tea. This is the original source of caffeine, and it's a fantastic broadleaf evergreen that you can hedge into a shrub. You can plant this, as a foundation landscape or even as a property border, and it just will never let you down. And when you tell people that you just made a pot of tea from a plant that you grew, all of your friends will be completely impressed. So why wouldn't you want to do that? Now, I like to grow spicy greens at the base of my camellias because deer do like to nibble on camellias. So the addition of spicy greens will help deter those creatures. So what we do is we actually mix all of our favorite salad ingredients into a bag. All that seed goes into one. We top dress with Soil³, and then we scatter the seed right on top. And what we have here, you can see that's a mix of like mustard and kale together, and we do arugula, and then Abby goes out and makes salads for everyone. And it's just a really practical way to have a living ground cover that's harvestable through the entire cool season. This is way cheaper than mulch, and it's a lot less maintenance. Now, arugula is so practical because it starts bitter, it ends bitter, you can let it bloom, and then it will self-sow. And actually the same goes for mustard. And I have a couple favorite varieties of mustard, Crimson Red and Garnet Giant. These are just really large leaf dynamic plants. I not only do we eat these, but I really like using them in cut foliage arrangements through the winter season. They hold up for weeks in a vase, so it's very practical. Now, I'm into red buds. If you're not familiar with this new variety of redbud, this is going to change your life. Cercis Flamethrower is one of the new varieties from Dr. Dennis Warner, who is with NC State. And this is the most amazing rainbow colored, looks like this from when it leaves out in early spring all the way through fall. It's just the world's most beautiful plant. Now, the one disadvantage that Cercis or redbuds have is that voles like to eat their roots. So what I've done, much like what Chris was mentioning yesterday, I just ring my redbuds with garlic. And I do harvest my garlic, but I am first and foremost using garlic as a means of keeping the voles and moles from going in and disrupting my root systems. So we love garlic. We plant about 800 cloves of garlic annually because we have a huge vole problem, and this is my approach to dealing with it. And we like to plant garlic along our bed edges. And like Chris mentioned yesterday, especially with hardneck varieties, you've got to remove that scape so that the energy goes back into the bulb. The scape is delicious, so you might as well eat it. But this is really just such a practical plant to grow because most people eat it. It's actually the most consumed vegetable in the United States, and 90% of the garlic sold in American grocery stores is being shipped all the way from China. So this is a plant that absolutely every home gardener should be growing. And thanks to Chris, you know exactly how, and you know exactly what varieties to be able to grow. Now, we harvest our garlic, and like Chris was saying, we have different methods for storing. I've really gotten into roasting it and then freezing those roasted cloves, and I actually eat them like candy. So sorry if I have garlic breath, but sorry, not sorry. All right, getting into Joe Pieweed, which is blooming right now. It's such an extraordinary native plant. I learned it as Eupatorium, but botanists keep learning more about the plant genome. So now it's Eutrochium, and it's a great pollinator plant for different native butterflies and bees. I like to grow it with my grandfather's favorite vegetable, kohlrabi. And he planted kohlrabi everywhere. I actually learned a foodscape from my grandparents, who were immigrants from Czechoslovakia living in the suburbs of Pittsburgh. And he just planted kohlrabi, like he literally had it around his, rhododendrons and, in every tree well, because he was addicted to eating this. I am too. I think it's just a really beautiful, kind of weird, fun plant. I like just to slice mine up and hit it with some salt and I'll never ever get tired of eating kohlrabi. Now you can't not grow figs if you live in the South. My two favorite varieties are Brown Turkey and Chicago Hardy, just because I do live in an area where we can easily get down into single digits. The further south you go, the more opportunities you have for growing figs. Fothergilla, this is a plant everyone should have. It's a fabulous native shrub. It doesn't grow so large. I think that Blue Shadow is one of the very best varieties of any plant that's been introduced in the last 20 years. And you know, I like to grow this with various culinary herbs because the herbs, again, will help deter browsing mammals. So, you know, I love to grow basil as an edge because I think that humans are actually the only creature that actually enjoy the flavor of herbs. I've seen rabbits come up to a basil edge and they like run to the next county. I also like to grow things like oregano and thyme, again, right along that edge to help protect the plants that are growing behind it. And then rosemary. You really can't beat rosemary. I wish that I would see rosemary grown more as a foundation plant because it does take to hedging quite well. But I also really appreciate the weeping rosemaries to grow in containers or over the side of a wall. And they're a really important nectar source for honeybees. Now, hedychium, ginger lilies, they're blooming right now. And I have never seen a ginger lily having grown up in Zone 5, Michigan. But honestly, this would be a reason to never leave the South because these are so remarkable and they just smell so good. And I like to grow my hedychiums with parsnips at the base. Now, not only because I like to eat parsnips, but because parsnips are also a great food source for our native swallowtail caterpillars. So the butterflies enjoy the nectar from the hedychium, and at the base of the plant, I have the food source for the caterpillar. So you get this full circle all right there in your landscape. Rain lilies, if you're not familiar with growing rain lilies, start Googling right now, okay? This is Hebranthus robustus, but there are so many different species of Hebranthus and Zephyranthes, and they are just the sweetest little things that will remind you that it actually did rain last night because, like their name, they truly do bloom following a rainstorm. Now, I like to grow my rain lilies with kale because rain lilies are summer active, kale is winter active. So the kale kind of provides seasonal interest, and in the season in between, those rain lilies will actually pop up through that dynamic foliage. Nepeta, because I'm a cat lady, I have to have some, you know, plants for my cats to go out and roll around in, and I really love Cat's Meow, and there's actually a new variety called Cat's Pajamas. Both of these are great because they're sterile, and that sterility leads them to having an all-season bloom. So these will start blooming in May, and they won't stop until November. So they actually have great fall interest. Again, they're in that Lamiaceae family, so the deer, groundhogs, and rabbits don't eat them. And I like to pair those with anything from the Umbelaceae family, which is a lot of different plants, including carrots and celery and cilantro and parsley. I grow those not only because I like cooking with them, but because I love swallowtail caterpillars and I love swallowtail butterflies. And I know that I have to have these plants in order to support their life cycle. Now, osmanthus is the scent of the season. If you live in the Southeast and you've been here in the fall, you know that the fragrant tea olive is just like hanging in the air, and it's so fantastic. So this is one of my favorite varieties, Osmanthus fragrans variety Aurantiacus. It's an orange flower so that you actually see it. But another variety that I like a lot is this new variety called Fadingzu. And the nice thing with this is that it's actually a repeat bloomer. So you're actually gonna get that incredible fragrance for a much longer duration of the season. At the base of that, we like to grow turnips because we recognize that we need to improve the soil, and this is an opportunity. And if you ever want to get kids to eat vegetables you never thought they'd eat, have them grow the seed, right? Hand them a bag of seed, and then cook them with culinary duct tape. And if you've heard me in person, we've had this conversation already, but for those of you not familiar with the term culinary duct tape, that would refer to bacon, butter, and cheese. And you can basically fix any vegetable by adding those three ingredients. Now, pawpaws. We're in the season of harvesting pawpaws right now. It's a fantastic native fruiting tree that does colonize. So I want to give you this tidbit. If you're growing pawpaws and you don't like the idea of them running, plant them out in your lawn so that you would be mowing around them, and that way you're able to sort of control their spread. Another fantastic fruiting tree that is harvested through the fall season are persimmons. And we do have a native persimmon, Diospyros virginica. I happen to like the hybrids of the khaki and the native together because they don't have quite as much astringency, so you can eat them when they're not totally ripe, and they're a larger fruit. They also fruit on lower branches, so they're easier to harvest. I find with my native persimmons that pretty much the raccoons and possums get all of the harvest, but with these hybrid persimmons, they actually leave a few fruit for me to be able to access. I love phlox. I would never want a garden without it. Not all phlox are created equal. And this variety, Mini Pearl, is a really old hybrid. It's actually a hybrid of Phlox divaricata and Phlox paniculata, so it blooms much earlier and it's mildew resistant. Now, if you're really into Phlox paniculata, I have two varieties that I recommend. Bright Eyes, which is here, and Glamour Girl, which is a new variety that was selected for a dwarf habit and mildew resistance. The bottom line is whatever phlox you grow, it's a pollinator magnet. Now, a variety that I don't have a great photograph of, but I highly recommend, is called Gina, and it has a smaller flower, but honestly, you'll never ever see more pollinators on one plant compared to Phlox paniculata Gina. Now, I like to grow Brussels sprouts with my phlox because phlox are winter dormant. My Brussels sprouts grow all winter long. Basically, the success rate I've had with Brussels sprouts has been very low, but last year I had my first successful harvest, 10 years in the making. I planted it in October, and it grew all winter long, and then I harvested the first week of April. So that's a long time to be in the ground to be able to get a couple of Brussels sprouts. I will tell you, my appreciation for purchasing Brussels sprouts at the grocery store has grown exponentially after my experience of cultivating it myself. And sometimes that is exactly the reminder that we all need so that we can give a farmer the credit that they deserve. Now, salvia. I love salvias. I like them because they don't tend to get munched on by creatures. And I love this variety, Violet Riot. Again, it's been bred for sterility, which ultimately leads to the plant doing a continuous bloom cycle. So this would be the replacement for the traditional cultivar May Night. The great thing with this is that you get blooms in May, and it continues to flower all the way until frost. So you really can't beat that as far as bloom season. And I like to grow potatoes with my salvias. The salvias are, mid-border. My potatoes are right along the edge because the potatoes are actually poisonous. Their foliage is poisonous to browsing mammals. So I plant potatoes any time of the year. This was the first plant that I introduced Aiden to. He is addicted to French fries. I decided he needed to understand where French fries came from. So we just plant our potatoes in a giant trench, and we do it along all of the borders. And we just stick little pieces of potato that started to grow on the counter. And then if you want to harvest new potatoes or the little baby potatoes, the signal for that is when they start to flower. And that's when you would actually dig the plants up. Now, this is actually how I'm able to grow kale in a convenient to access location. Basically, I dig a trench, I plant my potatoes, I cover them up, I wait 3 weeks, and then I plant kale right on top of that. And that foliage of the potato grows up and basically acts as an insurance policy to keep the rabbits and deer away from my kale. So I hope you're going to be inspired to go out and do something that maybe seem a little unusual, but turns out to be really practical. If you need more advice on exactly how to do this, you can check out my books. Also, be sure to research Roz Creasy and all the amazing work that she has done. Her books are not only beautiful, but full of really important practical information. And I hope that you all will keep in touch. I look forward to the day when we can all gather live and in person and actually ask questions to one another, because we all learn so much when we get to interact collectively. And I hope you all have a fantastic fall growing all of your favorite food crops. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Brie. I now have a new plant list picked out, a new shopping list. And before we go on a break, I want to give you an idea of our setting. We're here on a covered porch. We're at one of the Supersod farms in North Carolina. If you have heard crunching, that's trucks going by on the gravel. You've probably heard a herd of geese, or a flock of geese rather, and some hawks as well. So this lovely mantle was decorated by Sherry McMinn. She's the wife of one of the farmers who works on the farm. We're just really proud of the work she's done as well to contribute to this whole event. So come back in 5 minutes to hear Chris, to learn from Chris about Alliums. That's the onion family. Welcome back. Now we're going to hear from Chris Smith about Alliums, and I do want to remind you that in a few hours this presentation will be available on our Soil³ YouTube channel. It will always be available so you can watch it again and revisit stuff you maybe didn't catch the first time and want to hear again. Also, at that time, the comments section will be live, so you'll be able to ask questions there, and every time a question is asked or a comment made, we will get an email notification, so we will be answering them. Thank you. Here you go, Chris.
Thank you so much. I'm really excited to be back here today and have sat through that first presentation from Brie that was just a wonderful exploration of the diversity that you can incorporate into your garden. So I really enjoyed that, and it really spoke to me, and something that I'm a part of at the moment is this Utopian Sea project. And the mission statement of that Utopian Sea project is to explore diversity in food and farming. And we think of that as varietal diversity, so really exploring all the massive potential there is within a certain crop type. Like, I didn't mention okra yesterday and I felt guilty. So we've trialed over 150 different varieties of okra. So there's just massive potential there. But then also between crops as well. And that's what Brie was speaking to in terms of looking at the different family groups. And I brought a resource today that if a lot of you are kind of new to gardening and just trying to work your way, then I think this is a great resource that I use a lot. It's called Botany in a Day. And it's a real simple breakdown of looking at plants and IDing plants through the family structure into the genus and the species below that. So I think that's a really helpful tool that I use a lot, and actually referenced it as I was looking up some details for this presentation about Alliums. The other aspect of this, which is a kind of a sad aspect because it's not happening this year, but I've organized the WNC Garlic Festival for the last 7 years. We had to cancel it this year for obvious reasons, but I feel like this is like a small component where at least I get to share some of my love of garlic and the other fall planted alliums with you, so that you can at least get them into your landscape this year and grow them successfully, so that next year you'll be eating all sorts of garlicky and unique goodness. Or at least that's my hope. And also I chose this is a 300-foot row of okra I'm growing this year, and somebody else's corn behind me, so I'm making up for my okra from yesterday. But we're not talking about okra today. We are talking about alliums. So allium, when we think about allium, it's a genus. So we've got this big family group level, which contains lots and lots of genre, and within that we have allium. And then under allium, you'll have lots of different species. So we're gonna look at all the different species within the genus Allium. So you don't really need to know Latin to be a gardener, but it can really help you navigate some of the differences between crops and make you, or enable you to make better decisions in your garden landscape. What you're seeing here is just a picture of some of that diversity, and most of these aren't thought to be edibles. They are ornamentals. So within this genus of Allium, there's actually hundreds and hundreds of species, lots and lots and lots of different types of plants that you can grow within this single genus. And only a small group of them are considered to be true edibles. And that's what we're going to focus on today. But I wanted to leave you with the knowledge that all of them are edible. All parts of all of them are edible. And that doesn't mean they're going to be very tasty. I've got a good foraging friend that likes to say it's edible but forgettable, meaning yes, you can eat it and not get sick or die, but you wouldn't really want to have a full plate of it. Another friend, Doug Elliott, I have this in the back of my brain whenever I'm getting excited about this new potential food crop. I like to apply the Doug Elliott test, where he kind of just says, okay, so you can eat it, but would you eat a whole plate of it? And that's a good kind of check on me getting too excited about some weird crop that no one's ever actually going to eat, even though technically you can. So I've read a few articles recently. We're doing a lot of more allium trials through the Utopian Sea project. We've got a large variety diversity trial on garlic, and looking at some of the other species that I'm going to talk about today. And I've read a few articles where they've begun doing testings on some of these common ornamentals to see what type of food crop they have. So I personally haven't embarked on any of those ones yet, although we certainly will. And one related project we have this year is we have 100 dahlias in the ground, and they're from a cross, and we're going to assess them for the edible roots. So the root of a dahlia is edible, even though most of us grow it for the flower, and we're just trying to bring out those culinary traits to see which dahlias have the best traits. And I think the same potential exists within this fairly large genus of ornamental alliums. So that's pretty exciting work going forward. But for today, we're going to stick with more commonly known fall planted edible alliums. So that's our subset of stuff we're talking about today, but definitely beyond garlic. So just to kind of give us an overview, one of the reasons I like to present these as one big topic is because they kind of got a very similar treatment in the garden, a very similar growth cycle, and it helps to be able to go back to the presentation yesterday where we went really deep into all the intricacies of just garlic, and know that if you can grow garlic, then there's no reason why you can't apply most of those lessons with just little tweaks to grow all these other things that we're going to talk about over the next hour. So if you were tuned in yesterday, then you'll recognize this chart. It's just tweaked a little bit to include some extras. But basically, for all these things, we're taking some kind of clone of the plant. So that's either a clove from the garlic bulb, or a little bulbil from the Egyptian walking onion, or some part of the plant. And we're putting it in the ground in fall, and it's kind of doing slow fall growth to just get good root establishment. We're probably going to mulch it so that it's protected from the frost, although this does depend on where you are. I'm in the mountains of western North Carolina, so even though we're not very far north, we are at altitude, so it does get cold in the winter, and we need to protect those crops a little bit. And then once we start warming up in the spring, after what we call, like, we've got this concept of the Persephone period, and it's a general time in winter where there's not enough daylight for much plant growth to happen. And it's generally considered to be when the day length drops below 10 hours. And it's something that new time gardeners don't always consider, but is actually quite important. We always think about the temperature that we have, and we're like, oh, it's a really warm fall, that means everything's going to grow really well. Or we could say, we didn't get many frosts this year, so things are going to last for longer. And that's true to an extent. But while that weather is flexible up and down and is continuing to get more erratic, one thing that is not changing is the slow decline of daylight availability as we move towards the winter solstice. It's just, it's inevitable. It's planetary, and it's going to continue at a very predictable pace in the way that temperature doesn't change. So knowing that, we know that right here on November the 27th, we are going to have less than 10 hours of daylight. And while it's a gradual thing, then there's this period from the end of November to about mid-January where there's just not enough daylight for much to happen. So that's this period here where there's some root development underground, but we're not going to get much growth happening because it's cold and dark. We move into spring growth, and that's when things start waking up. That's the start of the season in a lot of our minds. The temperatures are definitely increasing, but critically so is the day length. And we're getting to that point where we're back outside of that 10-hour period, and we're getting longer days, and the plants are like, okay, this is ready to go. So we got the N there just to give a little bit of supplemental nitrogen, because for all of these alliums, we're trying to get really good leaf growth to support bulb growth later on. And then as that's developing, we come down, and this is where we get like our first harvest window. And so it's a pretty exciting time, and it can happen quite early in spring, depending on what we're going for. But all of the alliums have edible greens, so we can harvest the leaves and chop them up and saute them, put them in scrambled eggs, add them to wild mushrooms. You can do all sorts of things with the greens, and it's really an early garlicky, tasty time. You have to wait a long time to get the bulb, but the greens come early. Now, do note that if you just go out and strip harvest all your greens, then we've already said that the bulbs need the greens to form. So I tend to do selective harvesting. If I've got a whole bed of whatever type of allium, I'll just harvest a few leaves off each one, so the plants have enough to grow, but I've still got enough to eat. So it can be a bit of a balancing act there. And then we're going to move into this kind of general area of in the summer, we're likely to have seen a flower or a scape, which most alliums, it's pretty delicious to eat the flower, and the scape can be harvested. We went into some depth into that earlier, and we're going to touch on garlic again in a little while. But after that happens, the plants generally die back. There's going to be some sort of browning of the leaf, and they're going to die back. For the annuals like garlic, that's when we harvest it. For some of the perennials, we're just like, okay, it's gone dormant for a little bit in the height of summer, and then it'll pop back up again for fall. So this is where we kind of diverge and we get into the nuances between the different alliums, which we'll cover as we go through each of them. So we get into kind of the summer harvest. If it's a perennial, we're just letting it die back, and we know it's going to come back in fall. Storage and curing is pretty much the same for a lot of these bulb harvested ones. We want to pull it out the ground. I brought two examples here. We got a garlic and a shallot, and they've both got papery skin, and it's that skin that dries around the bulbs, which is what gives it its storage capacity. So we want to make sure we go through a good curing process. Again, we went into super detail into that yesterday. And then it can be stored somewhere cool, but not too cold. Medium humidity, so not too damp that you're going to get fungal diseases and mold, but not too dry that it's going to accelerate the drying of these bulbs and cloves. So, you know, I put mine in my basement. I'm kind of lucky to have a finished basement. Just kind of room temperature works for a good long time. Generally avoid putting them in the fridge because that's the temperature that will induce sprouting. And then we've completed the cycle. We're back to where we can, and this is where we are right now actually. I've done my harvest, I've done my curing. I'm waiting for it to be cool enough. October's my sweet spot for planting in the fall. And I'm going to go ahead and these can go in the ground and start that cycle again. Or some of these are perennials, so the cycle will start itself because I've left those bulbs in the ground. So that's the overall cycle, which hopefully gives you just puts you in some sort of place as we go through and speak about each of these. We don't have time to go into depth for each of them. So what I've done to set up this next section, I'm thinking of it like a Allium safari tour. I've got more text than I'd usually put on my initial slide, and that's so that you can go back and reference that as like a placard, and then we'll go into some pictures and talking around that crop before we move on to the next one. So not super depth on each of these, but hopefully enough to get you curious and interested to dig deeper and certainly incorporate them into your garden this fall. Okay, so Allium in Latin is garlic. So in many ways, garlic is the namesake of this genus. So it's nice to start with garlic and appreciate that it's the starter crop. Sativum is basically cultivated, so this is the cultivated garlic that we're talking about. Again, not going into too much depth because yesterday we did a lot of this, but I just want to remind you that we're making a decision between soft necks and hard necks, and the key differences between those two things are, I brought a hard neck for you and I brought a soft neck, and hopefully it's pretty clear that this one's got that central stalk and this one doesn't have a central stalk. So this is the soft neck and this is the hard neck. You could actually call it a necked garlic and a not necked garlic. And what this is the bolting flower stalk. So this one will not send up a flower stalk, and this one will send up a flower stalk. And the other name for the flower stalk is the scape, which you may have seen at farmers markets, or friends that have grown garlic might have this product called a scape. And we mentioned it in the growing cycle, but it's a really delicious early harvest that has mild garlic-like flavors, and just is a bonus of growing the hard neck. And then, so that's the big advantage of growing the hard neck. The downside is that this has got real tight, lots of layers of paper, and this one is more brittle. And so this one stores a lot better than this one. So you can get up to 12 months of shelf storage from a well-cured soft neck garlic, but you're somewhere in the 3 to 6 month storage period on this one. So if you want your whole year of like sustainable self-grown garlic, you're not going to get it if you're just planting hard necks despite having that bonus scape. So just, keep that in your head as you make your decisions on which one to go. And as first-time garlic growers, I'd always recommend that you do both of them, and you may end up like me, that you continue to want to grow both of them. And unless you're in the extremes of real southern heat or the extremes of really northern cold, you can pretty much grow both of these over a wide range of America. So they're both there as options. I've included this picture just to remind us that, and this is a kind of a personal philosophy, that I'm going down the rabbit hole in many crops, but most of the things we grow in our garden, we can eat multiple parts of that crop. We focus on that main primary crop, usually because that's what's offered in the supermarkets and it's what we know. But if you step outside of that primary crop thinking, you realize that many other parts of the plants become edible. And Brie was talking about edible flowers and edible leaves of other crops and that kind of thing. So keep going down that route. Make sure that it is edible before you eat it. Don't just assume. But within this genus Allium, you're pretty safe that all parts are edible, and then it's just working out which ones are really, really tasty. And in the case of these softneck garlics, these young green scallion-like plant growth is really, really tasty. It's still got that garlic flavor. You're harvesting it really young, so it's very, very tender, and you're harvesting it early, which means you're probably getting these out of the ground in March, whereas you wouldn't get an actual bulb harvest until June or maybe July, so it's a nice early garlic bonus. A few more pictures. I brought one of my braids that I showed yesterday. I don't claim to be an expert on braiding garlic. And in terms of learning to braid your own garlic, you'd be amazed at how many people have shared their expertise on YouTube. So just go ahead and Google around and you'll find a lot of follow along instructions on how to braid your own garlic. There's also lots of different techniques, so I wouldn't want to limit you to my inadequacies. Okay, and then so that was the hardnecks, that was the softnecks, these are the hardnecks. I've included down here at the bottom, and again I want you to think a lot of these as reference slides to go back to as you start digging deeper on your own allium journey. But once we go beyond hardnecks and softnecks, then we're breaking them down into further subtypes. And then when we go beyond those subtypes, we're going into varieties. And we find that there's hundreds of varieties of garlic to choose from. So it can kind of be a bit of an internet hole to go into, but it's a very fun hole to go into. And if you're doing garlic shopping, just make sure you read the descriptions and really just find something that speaks to you. They're all going to taste great if you're growing them in your own garden. And in this region, certainly you can grow whatever's on offer without really worrying about it in terms of zone and that kind of thing. And this is just a picture of the scape, in case you haven't seen that before. The key to the scape is if you're growing a hardneck, you have to harvest the scapes, otherwise they're going to severely impact the yield of the bulb. So it's kind of a choice between a real nice big bulb or having the scape actually go on and form a garlic flower. That's certainly an option open to you. The scape will become fibrous, a little too fibrous to eat as an actual vegetable, but the flower itself will be beautiful, will be edible, and forms these effectively miniature bulbils, which are like tiny garlics, and you can crumble them into any dish as well. So you have other eating options if you do let them go to flower, but just know it's going to impact your bulb harvest. Okay, so this is the last one that we talked about yesterday very briefly, is elephant garlic. It's a little bit misnamed. This is one of the reasons why, even as beginner gardeners, I'd encourage you to start thinking about the botany a little bit, because common names can lead you astray quite easily. This is actually more of a bulbing leek. It's called elephant because they get huge. I've got a picture of a clove of elephant garlic next to a normal sized clove of hardneck garlic, and you can see it's truly gargantuan. So that's fun, but when you look at the leaf growth, it looks more like a leek, and that's because it's extremely closely related to leeks more than the true garlics. You don't need to know that to grow it, but it's nice to understand the differences in your garden. It does mean that you can use these leaves as well. The bigger they get, the more fibrous they'll get, but when they're really young, they're a little bit like eating the leek greens, if you've ever used that part of the leek when you bought it in the store or grown leeks yourself. So the leeks, the bulbing leeks, the elephant garlic, is pretty fun to grow because you've got the flower that you can eat, you've got the scape that you can eat, the greens are pretty tasty when they're young, and then you get this massive bulb crop as well. I would say in terms of flavor and use, then all of our softnecks and hardnecks have a spicier, truer garlic flavor. Some people say the hardnecks are are more authentically garlic than the soft necks, but it's still going to taste great. Elephant garlics are definitely milder in taste. So they've got a garlicky flavor, but rarely much of that spiciness that you associate with garlic, certainly in the raw form. And what happens when you roast a whole clove, it kind of goes all mushy and gooey and delicious and caramelizes slightly. And we'll just put these whole cloves, don't even peel them, on a roasting pan and roast them. And then you can kind of squeeze them out like a paste. And you get this instant garlic paste to spread on toast or put in with pasta or literally whatever you want. But it's something that might be a little bit overpowering if you did that with garlic, unless you really caramelized it. But with elephant garlic, you can do that all day long, and it's a really quick, effective way to enjoy that massive, massive harvest. Okay. So now we're into new terrain that we didn't cover any of this yesterday. Shallots are pretty commonly known. I see them in the supermarkets sometimes. This is like a good-sized shallot harvest. I would say even a large shallot harvest. These guys are a little bit the norm. So they're kind of, if you've not seen them before, miniature onions is a good way to think about them. And actually in some countries, they literally call them miniature onions, like India, they're just called miniature onions. And if we again look at this botany down here, we see that these yellow shallots are Allium cepa, which is the same species as actual onions. So they are extremely closely related to normal onions, but they've been bred off in a different direction, a little like the kale and the collards have gone in two slightly different directions. And the difference with growing these guys over normal onions is that they fall within this broader category of multiplier onions. And so it becomes pretty exciting to know that you can plant one of these guys, and what effectively happens, I'm not sure what pictures I've got. What effectively happens is from planting one shallot, you get this multiplication effect where they'll have this clumping of lots and lots of shallots will grow from that one shallot. So you see this happening with seeds and seed saving. You plant one seed, and once it fruits and sets seed, you get loads back. It's like a return that you'll never see on Wall Street. Well, it's kind of the same, but on a smaller scale with these guys. And this is clonally reproduced, so they're genetically identical, but you still just, it's magic. I think gardening is magic. And we plant this one, and we get many in return. And so you could literally start with one of these. I could give this to you today, and you could plant it, and next year you'll have a handful of them, and then you could plant all of them, and we're on this exponential level of building up your own seed stock. And I think that's a pretty wonderful concept to take to grow your own food and create a surplus so that we can share the surplus, plant our own surplus, and have plenty to eat for ourselves and our neighbors. So I really like shallots. They're so similar to grow as garlic. The spacing is the same. We're talking about 6-inch spacing. And they have the same, almost identical, same pattern in terms of we'll plant in October and harvest in June-ish time. One of the differences, if you watched yesterday's, we talked about knowing when to harvest garlic is when the leaves start to dry from the base. And once you've got about 50% leaf drying, then garlic is ready to harvest. Shallots are in the onion species, so we know we harvest onions when they start falling over, so the green scape just kind of plops over. This is the green leaf, sorry, starts falling over, and once about half of the leaves have fallen over, we can assume that the onions are good to harvest. And so we use that rule for harvesting the shallots when they're all fallen over. But more so than garlic, we see this happening quite often when we grow shallots. We may plant them quite deep down, but they start pushing through the surface of the ground. You don't see that as much with garlic, but with shallots, I almost always see it. So you have more of a visual cue of what's going on with the bulb development than you do with the garlic, and I think that can be helpful too. Now in the kitchen, they're a little bit of a pain, right? You get one big onion, and you have to peel it, and it's kind of annoying to peel an onion, but you can understand it when you get a cup or 2 cupfuls of diced onion. Well, you're dealing with a miniature onion here, so you've got to do a lot more peeling, and those chemical compounds that are in onions that make you cry are in these as well. And so on some level, it's quite traumatizing to peel a whole bunch of these and cut them all up. But that's balanced out by their flavor. They've got such a beautiful, deep, oniony flavor that I really, really enjoy. And there's a reason why these are prized in French cuisine. And it's because of that. Like, the chefs love these. And so I think it's worth it. And because of that tight paper, they also seem to store really well. Sometimes it can be hard to grow really good storage onions in the South because a lot of those really good storage onions are actually long day onions, which means you have to grow them further north. And all the shorter day onions don't tend to store quite as well. But these guys I've left just in normal conditions in my kitchen, just in a wire basket, and they've been good for 6 months plus. They've stayed firm and really good. So I think that's bonus enough for growing them if you or I. The other culinary thing I love about these, and I think it's because of the intensity of the flavor, that really holds up to dehydrating. So often when you grow a lot of these alliums, you'll end up with this surplus that we've been talking about. And it's certainly true that the longer you store them, the more of them are going to start to deteriorate. You're not going to get 100% success for the full lifespan or the full expected lifespan of that crop. So what I tend to do with all of my allium bulb harvests is just keep an eye on them. Like every month I'll check in on them and just give them a little squeeze, and some of the garlic cloves or some of the shallots will start to get a little bit soft, and that means they're beginning to deteriorate. It doesn't mean you've lost that shallot at that point. Maybe in 2 weeks' time, it'll be a mushy mess and you wouldn't want to eat it. But when it's just starting to go soft, you can pull them out of storage and you slice them really thin and just lay them out on a dehydration. If you've got a dehydrator, you can just use that. You can also lay them on a baking sheet in an oven at the lowest setting with the door propped open to let out the moisture. And you just dehydrate them until they go crunchy and crispy, and you can pack them into a jar, and a whole lot of garlic mass will go down into a really compact jar of intense dried garlic flavors, or onion flavors in this case. And you can sprinkle them on top of a salad as a raw, crunchy garlic garnish. You could put them into a soup and they'd rehydrate to some extent and add all their flavors to the soup. And it becomes a really shelf-stable storage device for these allium flavors that you might lose if you were just to expect them to last for a whole year. So that's my kind of last-ditch effort to save any of these alliums, is once they start getting squishy, go ahead and dehydrate them. I wanted to show you this one as well, because you may have noticed on that first slide, which I'm leaving as a reference slide, that within shallots, we've got this allium species plural. So we've got like lots of different species within that general term of shallots. And that's pretty exciting as a gardener because it's speaking to this diversity that Brie was talking to. So we've got the ones that are just basically miniature onions, but we've got some other ones. We've got a Persian shallot, which is a different species, and we've got a gray French shallot, which the French refer to as the true shallot. That's like the shallot to rule all shallots. And this is a picture of that true shallot, the gray shallot. And it is available. Southern Exposure Seed Exchange have these for sale, so it's available to us in the United States, and it's a way to grow a few different types of shallots in your gardenscape. So potato onions are kind of a special one. It's fun because there's really early written reference to the potato onion. Potato onions go back to like 17th century Britain, where they've been written about in London markets. It's sometimes a little hard to tell the difference between a potato onion and a shallot. So they're both in this Allium cepa species. They both can technically multiply onions, so they grow just as I described with the shallots. You plant one and they multiply out into clusters. Here you can see a real nice cluster of the potato onions. So in many respects, they're kind of, the same. But as with many of these nuances within the crops, over multiple generations, they've been selected in a slightly different direction to give them some unique traits. And a lot of people are kind of like die-hard potato onion fans in a way that they're not die-hard shallot fans. And the two main reasons that come up is the potato onion generally gets bigger. So I was saying that this is, for me at least, is relatively standard for a shallot. This is actually a shallot, and it surprises me that it's so big, but that's more of what you would expect from a potato onion. So most of your crop would be this sort of size, so potato onions generally get a little bit bigger than your shallots. Even though you might get a few small potato onions and you might get a few large shallots, in general, we're going to be seeing this larger bulb size, which is pretty exciting. And then there's an opinion that potato onions have a more intense oniony taste. I have not personally experienced that. I've grown potato onions and shallots, and flavor-wise, I kind of find them fairly similar. Both delicious, but not necessarily too nuanced. That might be my culinary ignorance. I've worked with a lot of chefs through the Utopian Seed Project, and it's quite phenomenal to work with someone who's trained in the culinary arts and hear the way that they talk about food and experience food. It's a pretty fun journey that you can take yourself on. I'm not quite there with the difference between shallots and potato onions, but apparently it does exist. So if one of you have experienced that now, I'd love to hear about it. I've got these two websites at the top. These are where I borrowed the photographs from, but they're also two really good partners that I've worked with over the years. Cultivariable is a guy called William Whitson, who he's actually doing a lot of crop and variety improvement work. So he's not just maintaining a variety and selling it. He's getting the seed, he's doing some breeding work, and he's really trying to select for improved traits and yield and flavor on all these wonderful things. He's not just focused on alliums, he's got a whole range of excellent crops, but potato onions is one of the crops that he showed an interest in. And then I spoke about Ira Wallace yesterday. She is kind of like the head honcho at Southern Exposure Seed Exchange up in Virginia, and she really is, an allium expert, I would say. I've learned a lot from her myself, and she's very passionate about the flavors and the products. The potato onions are available from Southern Exposure Seed Exchange. There's a chance that So True Seeds still have some left as well. That's a company I used to work for up in Asheville. So you can still find these crops even though they're considered rarer heirlooms. And then while we're talking about Ira, I'll give a quick plug for her book. She has written a book on vegetable gardening focused just on the Southeast, but this one is more of a recent publication that came out this year, which is focused just on North Carolina. So if you're a North Carolina vegetable gardener, certainly if you're a beginner, this book is just full of fantastic information, including some of these alliums that we're talking about today. Okay, so this is maybe my personal favorite in the entire slide that we got today. Egyptian walking onions. They're sometimes called tree onions as well. They are just like an alien-esque majestic plant that looks awesome in the landscape and provides almost year-round edibility. They're a perennial, which I think really helps. And it's interesting when we talk about alliums as perennials and annuals, because it's more the way we treat them as opposed to what they truly are by nature. Because whenever they form this bulb, they all have the ability to overwinter. If you were to leave the garlic in the ground, and assuming it didn't rot or get eaten, it would resprout the next year and technically be a perennial. But we don't treat it like that, because if you leave a whole clove in the ground, a whole bulb in the ground, every single one of those cloves is going to try and resprout, and it'll severely impact the harvest to have effectively 10 little garlic plants all on top of each other. It's not going to be very happy growing in those conditions, so we tease them out and harvest them and store them and then replant them. So we treat them as an annual, even though they have the potential to be a perennial. But Egyptian walking onions, it's the opposite. We could treat them as an annual if we wanted to, and I'll talk about that in a little bit, but most people would plant them in the ground and just leave them, and they'll continue to regrow from the bulbs you leave in the ground. And that's because the main primary crop that we're talking about with Egyptian walking onions isn't that bulb that's growing underground, it's the top stuff. So if you've not seen these before, then just pay attention to this. It's the first time I saw these, I was like, is this a mutation in my garden? Is this an alien came and did experiments on my plant? It was really, really awesome to see. This one on the right is kind of a zoomed out picture of the way the plant looks. So it looks very much like an onion, We've got the bulbs underground. They have some of that multiplier onion effect. So what you'll see over time is that single plant that you planted will expand, and then it'll get side ones, and these will actually move around and take over a patch. But while you can eat that underground crop, you could harvest it like you would any of these other onion crops. It's almost so oniony. And I feel bad for saying this because I don't really believe it, but it's too oniony. It's like really, really intensely oniony to a point that you'd have to maybe put a little bit of it in a soup to really dilute it out. So when we've got all these other things like garlic and shallots and potato onions that offer a really just right oniony taste or garlicky taste, I don't often harvest the full bulbs. One, because I want it to be a perennial. I want it to continue growing from that same rootstock. And two, it's just not my favorite onion bulb to eat. But up above ground, these are getting pretty old here, but when those shoots are younger, they're delicious scallions. They come up really early in the spring, and they generally last quite a way into summer before they die back and then resprout again for a little bit of fall growth. And because I'm not focused on needing to grow this large underground bulb set, it doesn't matter as much that I harvest those scallions more heavily. So I might be quite cautious about harvesting my shallot and my garlic scallions because I don't want to impact that bulb growth. But with Egyptian walking onions, I'm like, I'm not actually going to harvest the bulbs, so just let's let it go. And I can eat them small, I can eat them big, and they just get more fibrous as they get bigger, but they're still pretty tasty. You just change the way you use them. And then you get the crowning glory. So you've got all that scallion growth that you've not had to worry about seeding because it's a perennial, and you get these little top sets here. And so what is happening is at the top of the leaf growth, you have basically a bulb that forms, and you get they call them top sets, but it's lots and lots of little clonal bulbs. And when you go to buy these Egyptian walking onions, as I heavily encourage you to do, you'll actually be buying the top sets. So once these guys dry down, they're little miniature bulb cloves, and that's what you buy. You buy them by the ounce or the 2 ounce, and so you'll get like 10 to 20 of these things, and you just plant them in the ground as if you were planting a seed, and it turns into one of those plants. The little top set bulb grows into a big bulb and then sends up its shoots, and the whole cycle repeats to produce one of these. So if you put one of these in your garden, the very next year you're going to have tons and tons of top sets to share, and you can really expand these out very quickly. And then the crazy thing, you get your top sets, and then the top sets sprout while they're still on the plant and send up fresh new tender scallions. And then those top set scallions also shoot, also flower and set buds, and you get a much smaller bud on top of that, and then they will send out smaller shoots. So you get like this kind of Russian doll effect in reverse as you go up the flowering shoots, more bulbils, more shoots, more bulbils. And it gets to a point where those bulbils aren't really good for replanting, but they're still really delicious to eat. It's just very dramatic and beautiful in the landscape, and totally edible. I've actually cut off these whole tops and kept the whole like Medusa-like garlicky, oniony head in one piece and rammed them into a jar and pickled them like that, so that when you pull them out, you're pulling out these like crazy looking pickled onions. So super, super fun to work with. I've actually, so they're called walking onions, and I wanted to address that. I've got a short 50-second video that kind of walks you through this patch and shows you how these plants, or why they're called walking onions. So we'll cut to that just now. I just want to show you why Egyptian walking onions are called Egyptian walking onions. When they flower at the top, they get really heavy and it bends over the stalk, and then that flowering bulb set at the top drops down. It'll send out roots, and that'll be a new plant that grows up there, and as it grows up, a new one will bend out and drop down somewhere else. This one's going into the potato patch, and then your onions will generally start to walk about your garden. So if you were to actually leave these and not attend to them at all, you certainly have like a day of the Triffids type thing going on in your garden. I wouldn't let that worry you in terms of an invasive thing. It's happening quite slowly as they go down and root out. And since it's all edible, you just go out and harvest to control that spread. Or if you've got a wild patch that you just want to let it go at, I don't have a homeowners association, so I'm probably the neighbor that nobody wants to have. But you can let these plants go totally wild, and they're really quite fun and dramatic in that landscape. And then I know I'm probably not speaking to that many market farmers, but I have sold these as bunches, and I just think because they look so dramatic, I bundled them with greens, and then the walking onion scallions with the top set heads. And I've then taken this bunch and put it on a box of a dozen eggs and just sold it as a ready-made omelet. And you can just go ahead and dice and shallow fry, add your eggs, and it's a pretty fun either thank you gift or market farmer type idea if you want to go for it. Okay, so now we're kind of in the realm of perennials now. The next two alliums we've got coming up are chives and garlic chives, and they're really quite similar in their makeup. And these are the ones that you may have grown before because you can start them from seeds quite easily. This is going to depend on where you are in the country. For me in my region, we wouldn't direct seed crops like leeks, onions, like true onions, chives, and garlic chives until late winter or early spring. So we'd be doing that in January, February sort of time. So I personally don't consider them as a fall planted allium. But I'm including the chives and the garlic chives because if you've got a neighbor or you've got a patch yourself, then this is getting into the perfect time to do some root division on these crops. So chives, you're probably aware of what chives are. They've got that perfect purple flower. You actually can go into the supermarket and buy little plastic boxes of really expensive chive shoots that, nobody should do. You should definitely you can have these in a container on your windowsill and grow chives really, really easily. And then once you've got one chive plant going, they will form this kind of crown that you can pull off into different sections and multiply from there. And then I think of chives and garlic chives as fitting perfectly into what Brie was talking about with the integrating it into your other landscape plants, flowering plants, shrubs, that type of thing. They make perfect border plants. And because you can multiply them so easily and they're perennial and they're beautiful, then they really fit well into that kind of edible landscape philosophy. So chives this is one of the distinguishing factors, they have a tubular leaf to them, and you probably know that from just using them in the kitchen. But when you jump into garlic chives, they've got a much flatter stem. And these are the ones that aren't as well known. Like most people know chives, but not as many people know the Chinese chives or the garlic chives. But in Asian culture, these are used all the time. Again, they're perennial, and you can see that they've got a really flat leaf in a way that the normal chives don't. So in this way, they look more like a garlic, which is why they're called garlic chives, and the chives look more like an onion with that tubular leaf. And I just yanked these out of my garden this morning. You can see that they're not growing very, appetizing looking bulb, but this is from a clump that goes, 6 to 8 inches in diameter, and it spreads out, and it'll keep spreading in that one place. Beautiful, 1 to 2 feet flower stalks, and the flowers are just kind of past peak, so they're kind of dropping off now and going to seed. But these can be pulled off. They either dried and stored or just crumbled straight into whatever dish you want to use, or into a salad. They can be eaten raw, and it's just I've got these on my front porch, and it's just so simple all the time just to step out, grab a handful of either the leaves or the flower heads. The flower stalks are a bit fibrous, and I use these all the time, and they're very tasty. And if you need culinary inspiration, then look to Chinese cuisine, Southeast Asian cuisine, and you'll see these cropping up quite a lot. So Chinese chives or garlic chives. And it's funny, they do have chives I think have more of an oniony flavor, and the garlic chives have more of a garlicky flavor. So if I'm in a window where I don't have any garlic stored, or the garlic's not quite ready, and we're looking to include a garlic flavor in a dish, then I go to the garlic chives. If we're looking to include an oniony flavor, I go to the chives. So two great perennials to keep around that can just be tucked anywhere in your landscape. This is one I'm only just beginning to play around with, so I don't have a lot to say about it. I was given one stalk at the beginning of the year, and I've kind of ignored it, but I've still got it to go in this fall. But it's following the same theory as the garlic chives and the chives, in that you plant one stalk and it multiplies out and you get these clumps of leeks. So this is the precursor to things like the elephant garlic and the true biennial leek that most of us are aware of as planting as an actual kind of spring crop. So you can see here it's got that same look, if you remember what the elephant garlic looked like. And down here you can see that clumping nature that looks a little bit like what I showed you here. So not a lot of dramatic bulbing at the base, but that's a propagation tool to spread out. And they can thicken up over time. I think it takes a few years for them to get up to a decent leek harvesting stage. But the idea of not having to start leeks every single year and having a leek harvest that's perennial is really inspiring. In fact, any sort of replacement of annual agriculture into perennial agriculture is really inspiring for me. Maybe it goes back to my lazy gardener mentality, but if plants will regrow themselves and produce a food crop without me having to do anything, then I'm all about that. So just to kind of wrap up them, I intentionally haven't gone deep into all the different planting aspects. If any of these have captured your attention and you want to give it a go this year, then that information is going to be readily available from the places that you source those plants. But I did want to leave you like just an overview reference to give you an idea of the main differences in terms of, is it an annual or perennial? What's the main thing I'm looking for in terms of propagation material, a clove or a bulbil, that type of thing. A little bit of spacing information, and then an overview of the different uses for those things. So I'm going to leave that in the video. It's going to be online on YouTube, so you can go back and reference any of these slides and this final chart as you start making your garden plans. Because remember, the beauty of fall planted alliums is you don't have to do it until October, so you've got a little bit of time to think, digest, and make your plans for this year to have your harvest for next year. And then I'm not going to go through each of these, but I did want to kind of continue encouraging you to expand out that thinking around alliums. We've gone from these, fairly well-known cultivated alliums, and then you've got these wild alliums. Ramps are pretty well-known around here, but you've got a whole bunch of other ones that maybe are growing in your lawn. Every single year I go out and have wild chives growing in my yard, and my daughter and I have this tradition of walking around the garden and doing foraging, and we do green foraging and always put some wild chives in a jar. We top it up with vinegar, and we leave that vinegar for a few weeks, and that's our spring vinegar. And it just infuses like just massive weeds, basically, and huge diversity there into a jar. And then we strain it out and have this really good tasting vinegar that we use for our spring and summer salad dressings. So chives fits into that for me every single year, but they all form the flower heads as well if you let them get that far, and they become another edible that you can have without doing anything. And then I would just want to remind you that the next step from the wild edibles, which are pretty accessible, is to the ornamentals. And that's something that I've not done much of. If you want to reach out and talk about that, if you've got experience with trying to eat your ornamental alliums, then I'd love to speak more about that. And if you follow along with the Utopian Seed Project, that's where we're doing all our crop trials, all our diversity trials, and we do a whole bunch of culinary trials as well to try and diversify our food system so everyone can enjoy a greater range of food crops. This is me personally at Blue and Yellow Makes on Instagram, and thank you so much. I hope you grow a whole bunch of garlicky, oniony goodness this year.
Chris, thank you so much. My shopping list is even longer now. And thank you both, Chris and Brie. I've learned so much. It's been so much fun, and we hope you subscribe so you'll hear more about events and videos we do. And also look back in a few hours on YouTube, sometime this afternoon. It will be a permanent link and available for you to watch anytime. Thank you so much for joining us.